How did a 13th century text rooted in local governance become the proof of an ancient civilizational clash? Today, we unravel how colonial powers reimagined the Chachnama to serve empire and what that means for our understanding of Muslim origins in South Asia. Welcome to the deep dive. We're really getting into a fascinating stack of sources today. They take this one historical text, the Chachnama, which you might have heard of, and basically flip the script on how it's been used over time.
Yeah, it's quite a story. The Chachnama itself, it's a 13th century Persian text. It covers the rule of a Brahmin king, Chakh, in Sindh, and then the arrival of the Arab general Muhammad bin Qasim around 711 CE.
Right, and that date, 711, and Qasim's campaign, that's usually presented as the starting point, isn't it? The beginning of Islam in South Asia.
That's the conventional narrative, absolutely. Muslims arriving as this completely foreign element leading to this inherent clash with the existing Hindu population, a clash that supposedly echoes right down to modern times, even influencing partition.
Yeah, that's the story I certainly learned.
And the Chachnama is often held up as Exhibit A for that story. Proof of foreign conquest, foreign origins for Muslims in the region. But what our sources dig into is how that interpretation wasn't always the case. It's actually a much later construction, heavily influenced by colonialism, and it's had some very real political consequences.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. We're going to unpack the sources, try to understand what the Chachnama was originally about back in the 13th century.
Exactly. And then trace how its meaning got transformed, especially under colonial influence.
And why that shift is so important for how we understand this history today. All right, let's get into it.
Okay, so first off, the sources really challenge the basics of the standard account, like the idea that the Chachnama we have is just a translation of some earlier Arabic work.
Yeah.
The argument here is, no, it was likely composed in Persian in the 13th century. That's its origin point.
Okay, so not just a translation, and not just a war story either.
Right. That's the other big point. It wasn't simply a chronicle of invasion. The sources present it as a much more sophisticated text. A work of political theory, really.
Political theory in the 13th century.
Yeah, drawing on both Indic, local South Asian political ideas and Islamic traditions of governance. It's a blend.
So if it wasn't just about Muhammad bin Qasim conquering Sindh, what was its original vision, according to these sources?
It seems it was intended as a kind of guide, maybe a prescription for just rule. How to govern effectively and ethically in 13th century Sindh. It was written for the rulers of that time and place.
That completely reframes it.
It does. It makes you see the text as reflecting the actual world. It came from a diverse society with women playing roles, different advisors, political elites, religious figures, all interacting. It talks about alliances, political continuity, not just this idea that 7-Eleven broke everything.
It sounds much more grounded, more regional.
Exactly. The sources stress that. It's a regional history. It focuses very specifically on Sindh, as the text defines it, and only covers about 2 generations of rulers. Think of it like other regional chronicles, like Behaki writing about the Ghaznavids' specific time, specific place.
Which is very different from those grand universal histories like Tabari that try to cover everything from Adam onwards.
Totally different scale. And that regional focus is really key to understanding its early reception.
How so?
Well, because it was so focused on Sindh for centuries, it was basically ignored by historians writing those big universal histories outside the region. Even famous works written later, like Abu Fazl's Akbarnama for the Mughal Emperor Akbar.
Right.
Abu Fazl talks about Emperor Humayun spending time in Sindh, but he doesn't mention Qasim or the Nationalist story. It just wasn't seen as relevant to the grand narrative of Islam or the Mughal Empire.
But people in Sindh knew about it.
Oh, yes. The sources show it was known and cited within the region. We have evidence from Multan. Travelers like Ibn Battuta mention Uch, where the text was supposedly found. So it circulated locally, but its impact was primarily regional for a long time.
Okay, so it starts as this 13th century text on governance, circulates regionally. What happens next in the centuries leading up to the British arrival?
Well, it continues to be used within Sindh between the 14th and 18th centuries, still mostly as a regional history, a history of Sindh and its people.
Any examples of how it was used then?
Sure. Take Mir Muhammad Masum. He was a Mughal governor in Sindh in the early 17th century. He actually summarized the Chachnama in his own history, the Tarikh-i-Masumi.
And why did he do that? What was his purpose?
It seems his main interest was administrative. As governor, he needed to understand the local power structures, the status of different communities. So the sources suggest he used the Chachnama, or at least his interpretation of it, to establish a kind of historical basis for political hierarchies under his rule. Figuring out who might be loyal, who might be problematic, based on their supposed history.
Using the past to manage the present.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He even includes this detail, which the sources think is probably his own addition, using the authority of the Chachnama claiming a specific tribe, the Chana, were the very first locals to become Muslim. Why? Because they saw Qasim praying and eating without caste restrictions.
So clearly adapting it.
Absolutely. He's tailoring it to his administrative needs. He apparently leaves out a lot of the original political theory, the bits about consultation, advice to rulers.
Did he make other changes to the story?
Yeah, some interesting ones noted in the sources. In his version, Qasim destroys the temple at Debel, but doesn't build a mosque right on that spot immediately. The caliph involved in Qasim's recall is presented as less morally questionable. And there's a dramatic change where Dahar's daughters are dragged by horses, not walled up alive.
Why those changes, do the sources suggest?
It's speculative, but maybe reflecting the political climate of the Mughal court, perhaps under Akbar, emphasizing responsiveness to the center, rewarding service, maybe aligning the narrative with current Mughal ideals.
Okay, that's the 17th century. What about later? You mentioned the 18th century, too.
Right, fast forward about a century, and you have Mir Ali Sherkani. He incorporates the Chachnama into his work, the Tufa-ul-Kiram, which is more of a social history of Sind.
A different focus, then.
Yes, much more on social customs, morality. He provides detailed summaries. Interestingly, he connects things in the Chachnama to practices he sees in his own time, like linking descriptions of Qasim's prayer posture to yogic poses he observed.
And his version of Qasim's story, does it differ?
Significantly. Khani's Qasim is much more accommodating. He marries Dahar's sister, he allows a new temple to be built, he apparently forgives the jizya tax for ascetics, and he builds mosques alongside existing temples, not necessarily replacing them.
Wow, that's a very different picture from the standard conquest narrative, more like integration.
Exactly. Khani emphasizes Qasim's piety, his religious devotion, even interpreting things like Qasim praying for 3 days after taking a bull through the lens of Sufi asceticism, which would have resonated in the 18th century.
So, putting this together, Masum in the 17th century uses it for administration, Khani in the 18th for social history and emphasizing cohabitation.
It shows the text had this dynamic life within Sind, being interpreted and used for different local purposes, political theory, administration, social understanding. And crucially, the sources point out this is happening right around the same time that a completely different interpretation starts taking shape, thanks to the East India Company.
Okay, so that's the pivot point. The sources highlight a figure named Farishta writing in the early 17th century in the Deccan. His work seems to be the first time the Chachnama gets pulled into a broader, more universal-style history written outside Sind itself.
That's right. Farishta wrote this large history covering different regions of India. And interestingly, even as he uses the Chachnama for the Sind section, he also notes that there were Brahmins visiting Mecca and a substantial Muslim community before Qasim's campaigns in 712.
But his work traveled far beyond India.
It did, and this is critical. Farishta's history made its way to Europe, and that text became the main source for 19th century British scholars trying to understand India's Muslim past. The sources really frame this journey, Farishta's text going from the Deccan to London, being reorganized and interpreted there as the actual making of the colonial narrative about Muslim origins in India.
Which leads us to Alexander Dow, late 18th century East India Company employee.
Yes. Dow takes Farishta's history, brings it to England, and produces what he calls a translation, though it's more of a summary and reorganization. And he's incredibly upfront about why he's doing it. He states in his introduction that this knowledge is essential for the company's project of dominating India.
He had a clear agenda then.
A very clear one. He argued that Muslim rule was fundamentally about suppressing Hindus, making them invisible. He dismissed Farishta's own use of Hindu sources as just proving how weak Hindu history was. And he really pushed this idea of a fundamental categorical difference between Hindus and Muslims.
How do you characterize them?
Hindus as inherently weak, passive, destined to be conquered. Muslims as naturally suited for conquest, inherently cruel. It's a stark binary opposition.
And crucially, he restructured Farishta's work.
Yes, he pulled the section on sin, based on the Chachnama, right to the very beginning of his history of Islam in India, making that 7/11 event the absolute starting point.
And Dow's version becomes influential.
Hugely influential in Europe. It established this framework. Indian history understood primarily through the lens of Islamic despotism over Hindus, and this directly feeds into James Mill's incredibly important History of British India, published in 1817.
Ah, Mill. He's the one who gave us that classic three-part structure of Indian history, right?
Exactly. Ancient Hindu Golden Age, then the medieval Muslim Dark Age, and finally the British arriving to bring enlightenment. Mill built directly on Dow's framing. The arrival of Islam in 712 CE becomes the Great Rupture, the event that supposedly sends India into decline. And this wasn't just academic, it became foundational for company policy and how they gathered information about India.
Which brings us right up to 1843 and the British conquest of Sind itself. The sources argue this wasn't just about grabbing territory.
No, they frame it as an epistemological conquest too, meaning it was built on creating and reinforcing a specific way of knowing India.
Based on that narrative of difference.
Precisely. Built on those colonial narratives of inherent, unavoidable conflict between Muslims and Hindus, the British justified their own conquest by presenting themselves as liberators, freeing the supposedly oppressed Hindu population from centuries of Muslim tyranny.
And this is where the Chachnama gets locked into that one, meaning the conquest narrative.
Exactly. It becomes the historical precedent, the justification for the 19th century British conquest. It's ripped out of its 13th century context and repurposed.
Can you trace how that happened on the ground?
The source is laid out. The company's interest in Sind grew strategic location, fear of rivals like the French or Russians, control of the Indus River for trade, including, frankly, the opium trade. They pushed treaties onto the local rulers, the Talpur Mirs, aimed at excluding competitors and gaining access.
You mentioned Alexander Burns earlier, his trip up the Indus.
Right, in 1830. He notes that locals saying, "Sind is lost now the English have seen the river." And Burns himself comments, revealingly, that British influence will benefit the general populace but be bad for the Suds, the Muslim elite tied to the Talpur regime.
So the tension was building.
Definitely. More restrictive treaties followed in the 1830s. Then comes Governor-General Ellenborough in 1842, making that symbolic gesture with the supposed Gates of Somnath, claiming to avenge an 800-year insult, explicitly linking British actions back to countering supposed Muslim tyranny that began implicitly with the Arabs.
And then Sir Charles Napier arrives.
Napier, the commander. The sources portray him as seeing the conquest as almost a religious duty, a Christian obligation to overthrow the Muslim Talpur rulers, whom he considered tyrants destroying the country. He apparently disregarded treaties, didn't speak the local languages, but was convinced he was right. He defeats the Talpurs in battle at Miani in 1843 and annexes Sind for the company.
Even though there was debate about the justification.
Yes, the conquest was controversial. Even then, questions were raised back in Britain. But it happened. Sind was annexed.
And after the conquest, the British officials really started digging into the Chachnama.
They did. Following Dow's lead, you get this generation of company officials, Orientalists, scholars, linguists, administrators, actively excavating the text, as the sources put it.
But excavating it with a specific goal in mind.
Absolutely. To interpret it as the definitive testament to that originary Mohammedan conquest, the source of all the supposed problems the British were now correcting.
So the British conquest becomes the corrective sequel to the story they read in the Chachnama.
That's exactly the framing. They presented themselves as emancipating Hindus from these foreign Muslims, using the Chachnama as the historical proof. This involved finding manuscripts, translating them, and crucially, adding annotations to guide the reader's interpretation. Figures like James McMurdo, Thomas Postans, Richard Burton were key here in the early to mid-19th century.
What kind of picture did they paint?
McMurdo describes Sindhi rulers as inherently treacherous, Muslims as bigoted. He saw the entire period from Qasim onwards as a dark age for Hindus, claiming they lost their patriotism and became helpless servants, creating a natural schism. He called Chachnama the principal Persian manuscript authority and depicted Sind as a kind of Hindu paradise destroyed by Muslim barbarity. He really focused on the stories of Qasim converting temples to mosques, claiming it caused general despondency.
And Richard Burton, he was Napier's aide, right?
Yes, deeply involved. He pushed a similar narrative. Ancient paradise destroyed by Muslim fanaticism. He emphasized alleged wartime atrocities. The sources show he even combined different episodes from the text, like descriptions of a massacre at Dable, with Qasim's interaction with an idol there to argue Qasim enforced a deliberate policy of discrimination from the start. He linked Qasim to a long line of invaders, stressing the outsider status and the rupture it caused.
And this wasn't just abstract history writing.
Not at all. McMurdo, Postins, Burton, their interpretations were explicitly used to justify Napier's actions, to paint the recently overthrown Talpurs as illegitimate heirs to the supposed tyranny, and to underscore the narrative of Hindu oppression that the British were supposedly ending. The sources argue this process really flattened Sindh's history and locked the Chachnama's meaning onto that single image of temple destruction.
And this interpretation then fed into mainstream academic history.
Directly. Mount Stuart Elphinstone's influential History of India, 1841, saw Muslim conquest driven by fanaticism, using Chachnama as evidence of this strife. He did note Qasim's complexity, moments of ferocity alongside moderation, but framed it within that larger conflict narrative. He acknowledged Hindu resistance, but ultimately attributed the Arabs' failure to conquer all of India partly to the resilience of the Hindu priestly class against conversion.
Then there's Henry Mears Eliot. His multi-volume history seems pivotal.
Hugely pivotal. History of India as told by its own historians. His stated aim was to impose European truth and rescue the history of the supposedly silenced Hindus now freed by the British.
And he put Chachnama front and center.
Right at the very beginning of his collection. Volume 1 starts with it, cementing its status as the foundational text for Muslim rule. He acknowledged it had an air of truth, but he interpreted any ethical questions raised within the text about Qasim's actions as proof of the inherent flaws of Muslim rule itself. In notes, he dismissed Muslim invaders as generally ignominious.
Even Qasim.
He called Qasim better than later invaders, but still focused on wanton destruction and massacres. He wondered why the Arabs left so little permanent mark, blaming their internal conflicts and asserting there was no sympathy between conquerors and conquered.
And he had that infamous line.
Yes, hoping Indians would study these histories to appreciate their past degradation before the arrival of British supremacy. His project was incredibly successful in embedding that narrative. Conquest origins, fanatic Muslims, weak Hindus.
And this became the standard textbook version.
Absolutely. Historians like Vincent A. Smith and Stanley Lane Poole, writing widely used textbooks in the early 20th century, picked up this framework. It shaped school curricula, civil service exams. 7 and 12 AD became, as the sources call it, a totemic date, the definitive breakpoint. Lane Poole explicitly defined the entire medieval period as starting with foreign conquerors imposing an exotic creed, and he directly recommended Eliot's translations.
Okay, so that's the powerful colonial narrative. Now, how did Indian nationalist historians react to this picture of Muslim rule as inherently despotic and foreign?
Well, the sources show it was complex. The responses varied quite a bit, but a key point is that many of them, even while pushing back against the colonial judgment, still tended to operate within the framework established by the British, the idea that Chachnama was fundamentally an 8th century origins text about the conquest.
So they accepted the basic premise, even if they argued about the interpretation.
In many cases, yes. Some prominent nationalist historians, figures like Jagannath Sarkar or R.C. Majumdar, actually ended up reinforcing aspects of the colonial view. They continued to see Muslims primarily as foreign conquerors, fundamentally different because of Islam. Majumdar, for instance, described Muslims as natural conquerors.
But others tried to challenge that negative portrayal.
Definitely. You had historians like Muhammad Habib, who came from a Marxist perspective. He tried to recuperate the conquest narrative, but from anti-colonial angle. He made a distinction between the Islamic faith and the actions of individual Muslims. He argued the Sindh conquest was part of a longer history of Arab-India contact, not just invasion.
How did he portray Qasim?
Habib presented Qasim as ethical, brave, highlighting his policies of toleration towards non-Muslims and the fact that he relied on local support, including from Hindus. He argued against the simple narrative of domination, suggesting a more complex reality, directly countering the British account.
What about historians from Sindh itself? Did they engage with the text?
Yes, the sources mention scholars like Dadpoda and Bullock, who worked specifically on recovering and translating the entire Chachnama text. Their focus was often on reframing it as a regional history, the story of Islam's origins in Sindh specifically, pushing back against its use as a universal origin story for all of India.
And were there responses from Muslim intellectuals outside of formal history departments?
Yes. Figures like Shibli Nomani and Suleiman Nadvi focused more on social history and the long history of Arab-India connections, trying to establish a Muslim presence before 712 to emphasize social integration over military conquest. Nadvi was very direct, stating that British histories were intentionally written to sow distrust between Hindus and Muslims and to denigrate the Muslim past.
So, a range of responses, but the core idea of Chachnama 8th century conquest proved hard to shake.
It seems so. The sources suggest that despite these efforts, the dominant view among many historians remained focused on the 8th century. The idea of reading it primarily as a 13th century text about political theory or as a reflection of a diverse medieval society often got lost. It was seen as an origins text, maybe with some superfluous stones, as one historian put it, but the conquest narrative remained central.
Okay, let's jump forward then. 1947, the creation of Pakistan. How does this Chachnama narrative fit into the new nation's story?
It becomes absolutely central, foundational even. The 711 AD conquest narrative, framed through that colonial lens but now repurposed, becomes a key part of Pakistan's official state history. Historians like Ikram were very influential in promoting this, and it got embedded deeply in state-produced textbooks.
So Qasim's arrival becomes Pakistan's origin story, in a sense.
In a very real sense, official publications, even early ones like 5 Years of Pakistan from 1953, explicitly connect archaeological digs at places like Bamhor, believed by some to be Daebul, to understanding Pakistan's Islamic roots. They called Sindh the first province of the subcontinent to receive Islam through Qasim's conquest. Notice the use of province linking the historical region to the modern administrative unit of Pakistan.
And this wasn't just passive, it was actively promoted.
Oh, very actively. The state consciously developed this narrative through textbooks, monuments, museum displays. This intensified significantly after 1971 and the separation of Bangladesh, as the Pakistani state sought narratives to reinforce a unified Islamic national identity for West Pakistan.
Especially under General Zia-ul-Haq later on.
Absolutely. From 1977 onwards, Zia's government implemented education policies explicitly designed to link Pakistan's national identity to the universal Muslim Ummah. Islam and nationalism were fused, and the 711 narrative was a key part of that.
How was it taught in schools?
The sources say textbooks, starting from around the 4th grade, taught this simplified narrative. They emphasized Qasim's supposed good and kind treatment, which allegedly led Hindus to willingly embrace Islam. This first contact model contrasted these supposedly benevolent Muslim warriors with the atrocities of the Hindu rajas who ruled before.
So, a very specific sanitized version focusing on easy conversion.
Right. The narrative claimed locals were fed up with their previous rulers and readily accepted Islam because of Qasim's kindness. The implicit lesson often was that history relevant to Pakistan began in 711, is contained within its borders, and perhaps later Muslim rulers didn't live up to Qasim's idealized standard.
Did this narrative extend beyond official state channels?
Yes. Religious political parties like the Jamaat-e-Islami organized public events, like the Yawm Babul Islam, the Day of the Gateway of Islam, specifically celebrating Qasim. They glorified him and often linked his historical role to contemporary needs, suggesting, for example, that a new Qasim was needed to combat modern perceived injustices.
He becomes a real hero figure then.
A major one. Popular culture picked it up too. Heroes of Islam type books, comics, novels for young people, all celebrating Qasim and his companions, sometimes portraying them as the earliest Pakistanis. You even see specific communities, like the Arain, tracing their ancestry back to Qasim's soldiers in communal histories, using this lineage to argue for social status or importance, sometimes connecting it to roles in government service.
So what's the takeaway here? A 13th century text ends up underpinning a 20th century national identity.
That's the trajectory the sources trace. And note that the state-sponsored narrative, centered on the 711 conquest, hasn't faced significant challenges from within mainstream Pakistani historiography recently, partly because there hasn't been much new research focusing on that early medieval period, 8th, 12th centuries. So challenges often come from outside academia, from communal memory or political debate.
Which brings us back to the listener. Why should you care about all this? About one 13th century text and how its interpretation got twisted over time.
Well, I think this whole story is a really powerful case study in how historical narratives work. They aren't just fixed facts from the past. They get constructed, they get argued over, they get repurposed again and again, often for reasons that have little to do with the original context.
It really shows how a text, even one that seems like a straightforward history, can be bent to serve completely different political agendas. From, advising a local ruler in the 13th century.
To justifying a massive colonial empire in the 19th century, to building a national identity in the 20th. It's quite a journey.
Understanding this journey helps us, hopefully, be more critical consumers of history ourselves, especially when we encounter narratives about conflict, about us versus them, about fundamental differences between groups. It pushes us to ask, who is telling this story, and why now? What purpose might it serve?
Yeah, and it also highlights, I think, how easily simplified narratives can take hold, especially when dealing with complex pasts. The colonial framing conquest rupture difference was powerful and relatively easy to grasp. It overshadowed the more nuanced, messier reality of the text's original context and its pre-colonial life, and that simplified version proved incredibly sticky.
So let's quickly recap the journey we've taken in this deep dive. We started with the Chachnama, not as a simple conquest story, but as a 13th century Persian text, likely a work of political theory for regional governance in Sind.
Then we saw how it was used within Sin for centuries, adapted by figures like Mir Masum for administration and by Mir Ali Shirkhani for social history, emphasizing accommodation.
Then came the huge shift with the Colonial project. Farishta's history travels to Europe, Dow reframes it, Eliot cements it, Chachnama becomes the evidence for an inherent Hindu-Muslim conflict, justifying British rule. 712 AD becomes the breaking point.
We saw varied nationalist responses, sometimes challenging the colonial interpretation, but often staying within its basic framework. And finally, how that 711 conquest narrative, heavily shaped by the colonial era, became a cornerstone of national identity in Pakistan, promoted through state channels and popular culture.
The core insight, really, is that this seemingly simple story, Islam arriving in South Asia through foreign conquest in 712, is actually the product of centuries of interpretation, profoundly shaped, maybe even created in its modern form, by the specific needs of the British colonial empire to establish a narrative of fundamental difference.
And that leads to a final thought, maybe something for you to consider. If this one text, the Chachnama, could be so dramatically transformed and repurposed over time, serving agendas from local governance to empire building to nation building, it really makes you wonder, what other histories, stories about the past that we think we know, might also be powerful narratives that have been crafted, debated, and reshaped across generations?
And how do we, today, try to peel back those layers of interpretation to get a clearer sense of the past itself? That's the ongoing challenge.